Hello, everybody. My name is Rebecca Ross. I'm the director of the Graphic Communication Design program at Central St. Martin's, University of the Arts, London. Today is March 9th, 2021. The UK had been under a fairly strict national lockdown since Christmas, but as of yesterday, we have been able to start opening our buildings to offer students access to libraries, workshops, and other facilities, which we're really excited about. But since college buildings are currently closing at 4 p.m., I am again hosting this evening's event from my flat a couple of miles down the Regent's Canal from CSM. So this is the fifth event in our program's first ever online lecture series titled Depth of Field, which is also our first ever public event series. I'd like to once again extend a warm welcome to all of the GCD students in the UK and around the world, and to our guests, whether listening live or tuning in later. We hope that everybody is keeping safe. On our Depth of Field website, csmgcd.net/lectures, you'll find an intro to the series, playback of previous events, and some more links and information related to tonight. I'd like to also remind everybody that we call this a lecture series, but it isn't actually made up of long lectures. Most of the events follow a standard format designed to foreground conversation. So we invite two different speakers on the basis of some kind of interesting and relevant connection between their work and our field. And together I work with them to co-create a more specific focus and title. Each speaker then takes a brief 15-minute turn to introduce some examples and their perspectives. And from there, I moderate a discussion which will draw in questions from our audience on YouTube. And as a reminder, if you do want to participate in the discussion later, you will need to sign in to YouTube. So for tonight's event, we are excited to be joined by Silas Monroe and Patricio Davila. Silas is Associate Professor of Communication Arts at Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles and a partner of Polymodality Design Studio. Patricio is Associate Professor at York University and co-director of the Public Visualization Lab in Toronto. And I'll say a little bit more about each of them later. In the early part of 2020, before the pandemic, many members of the GCD community visited the W.E.B Du Bois Charting Black Lives exhibition, which was on view at the House of Illustration, our friends right next door to CSM in Granary Square. So W.E.B Du Bois is well known as a sociologist and for co-founding the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the US. And the House of Illustration exhibition presented a collection of information graphics developed by Du Bois and a team of African-American students at Atlanta University at the turn of the 20th century, some of which were exhibited at the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1900. So these graphics, in addition to charting the lives of Black Americans, were designed to challenge the kind of pseudo-scientific racism prevalent during this time. Many folks watching tonight will be familiar with this book, Visualizing Black America, edited by Whitney Battle Baptiste and Britt Russert, which was published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2018 and is the first catalog of these information graphics in book form. It also features a contribution and captions written by Silas, one of our guests. So we highly recommend this book, particularly if you didn't make it to the exhibition. In addition to disputing racist claims, the collection of these turn of the 20th century information graphics raises a number of important questions regarding contemporary relationships between information, data, visual language, politics, and identity. It is for this reason that they are the springboard for our discussion this evening. So we're going to start with Silas, who will elaborate on their wider historical and thematic context. And from there, Patricio is going to draw out some of the connections with pressing contemporary questions about the politics of information and data. We're particularly interested in some of the challenges around data visualization and information design practices in the context of racial and other social justice movements. How can we balance wariness of the unsituated authoritative voice commanded by so many information graphics, particularly those associated with early 20th century social science, with their deployment in the service of underrepresented communities? How can we consider and deploy information design and data visualization techniques in ways that strengthen accountability and reciprocity? And in 2021, as misinformation proliferates and algorithms which process our identity characteristics, often outside of view, become more prevalent, these questions take on some new significances. So Silas is going to speak first. As I mentioned earlier, Silas Monroe is partner of Polymode, which is a bi-coastal design studio in the US that creates poetic research, learning design, artistic practice, and applied design with clients in the cultural sphere and community-based organizations. Silas is an associate professor at Otis College of Art and Design and an advisor and chair emeritus at Vermont College of Fine Arts. So Silas is currently delivering a course in Black data at California College of Art, as well as an online short course on BIPOC design in America, which I know some members of the GCD community at CSM have been attending, and has a fantastic community of contributors. Silas is joining us from Los Angeles, where it is currently around 9:30 in the morning. So I'll pass it over to you for now, Silas.
Thank you so much. Can I share my screen here? I just wanted to say thank you, Rebecca, for asking me to be here in dialogue with Patricio. And Patricio, I'm looking forward to our conversation, maybe sparring a little bit or dancing. I wanted to give a land acknowledgement, as Rebecca mentioned, where I'm coming from, but these are also the unceded lands of the Chumash, Tongva, and Kitsch people, which we now call Inglewood in Los Angeles, in California, and in the United States. And I think giving these remarks after the continuing reckonings sparked by George Floyd's murder has a different resonance for me. This is research I've been doing for many years, but the continued murder of Black people due to systemic racism and police brutality, I think it shows the continued importance of the work of W.E.B Du Bois and his students. And yet that doesn't take away from my feelings of being emotional at the moment. And I just want to give myself and you all permission to be in that difficult reality of feeling it. And I feel and argue that design is an emotional act and that there's a sensory quality to design that is all about feeling. And so, as mentioned, this term polymode, which is the name of my studio, and I think just breaking down that word is a riff on this idea of a polymorph, which is another name for someone who shapeshifts. And polymorphism is actually a common theme in folklore of many cultures and civilizations, and as well as more contemporary science fiction and fantasy. And so for me, this actually came from a project at CalArts when I was in graduate school. And it was really about this idea of like, how do you form a design identity that's constructed from fragments and a variety of approaches. And so I come to Du Bois through this polymodal framework. And that means I have many facets, right? Like surfer, teacher, BIPOC, mystic, dancer, academic. I have all of these things that I bring. Queer. This is just an image of that thesis. And I think if you think about Du Bois in his career and what he did, he was also a polymode. He had a lot of different things happening in his practice. And I think one of the other things that we have in common is that we're both interested in making cool shit. For me and my studio, that means catalogs, information design, websites, and Du Bois had this hunger to, even though he's trained as a sociologist, he would make this compelling body of work that I'm going to talk about specifically, which is this exhibition that he created that was situated in Paris in 1900 at the World's Fair. And you can read more about it in this book, which is collaborative, and the research that I'm going to share here is connected to that. And I think, including with BIPOC history, I'm really interested in how do you make collective knowledge that comes from multiplicity and multiple points of view. I think my main criticism with design history and the way that it's been framed has been this idea of like a monolithic viewpoint. And so I just want to call out a couple of other collaborators in addition to Britt and Whitney, who are mentioned, but Mabel O. Wilson, who is an architectural critic, has an amazing essay in the book as well. And then Alden Morris, who is the foremost living Du Bois scholar, also contributed to it. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is this quote from Du Bois, where he talks about the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And he was a prolific author, renowned sociologist. He was a civil rights activist and advocate. As mentioned, he started the NAACP. He was a historian and poet, but he's also this pioneer of data visualization. And this quote comes from one of Du Bois's most seminal texts called The Souls of Black Folk, which actually is published in 1903. And I think this quote is interesting because it cuts through this intersection of both race and class. And he also mentioned this quote in a lecture in 1900, in the year that he's forming and generating these amazing diagrams. And just these are thumbnails of what those diagrams look like. There's approximately 63 data visualizations in the set, although there have been photo documentation of prints that are like not in the collection of Library of Congress. So there could have been more, and there likely were. And these are made in ink, gouache, graphite, and sprinklings of photographic prints. And I think it's also really critical to know that he did these in collaboration with his students and alumni at Atlanta University, which was a historically Black college. And when Du Bois was presenting these plates in Paris, he had this actually very glamorous kind of public figure and presentation, as well as amazing style. And it's interesting that Du Bois, who was born in 1868, which is 5 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, described himself, and this is a quote, "In general thought and conduct, I became quite thoroughly New England." So even though he's this Black man, he's from this northern context of the United States. He's raised by his single mother and grandmother. He goes to Fisk University in Tennessee, and then he goes to Harvard for a second bachelor's. And then he gets a PhD in sociology. He's the first Black man to do this. Also, before this exhibition, he would have studied in Berlin. So he was already familiar with migrating Europe and being basically like upper class, a term that he called the talented tenth. And you can see that like in his style, like he just exudes this kind of like almost like heroic image. And I think one other thing that I want to mention, in addition to all the things I mentioned, his talents, Du Bois also is an author of speculative fiction. So he wrote this manuscript. This is an image of it called The Princess Steel. This is later in 1908, 1910. And basically in this sci-fi tale, he writes about a Black sociologist who stages this magnificent experiment at the top floor of a Manhattan skyscraper overlooking Broadway. And the main focal point of the story is this megascope, which is a fictive technology that looks like a giant trumpet, and it's laced with quote unquote silken cords like coiled electric wire. It's equipped with handles, eyepieces, and earpieces. And when this sociologist is hooked up to the megascope, users are able to view the great near, which is Du Bois's term for the always present but usually invisible structures of colonialism and racial capitalism that shape the organization of society. The vision produced by the megascope, a fantastical feudal allegory of primitive accumulation, centered on this epic battle between two knights for the possession of an African princess whose hair is made of steel, generated in part by data contained in a massive set of volumes lining the wall of the laboratory, a vast set of demographic studies collected for over 200 years by some kind of silent brotherhood. And so the fictional version of Du Bois, Dr. Hannibal Johnson, the sociologist and protagonist of the story, uses data to plot what he calls the laws of life onto a thin, transparent film covered with rectangular lines and pierced with tiny holes. So he like is writing this like fictional version of himself, which I think is super interesting. And just to give some additional context, a lot of the diagrams were actually created by his students, most of them women of color. And one of the things that Britt and Whitney talk about in introduction to the book is this idea of the co-creation and creation of this kind of like public sociology between these authors who are people of color from the United States and these like white European fairgoers. And so it would be interesting to sort of think about how these sort of like working class visitors, pan-European people who were touring this exhibition, like how did they make meaning of the data on their own terms? And part of what's interesting and challenging about this idea of Du Bois is this like superhero, like public, intellectual, academic person of color was the fact that it was actually easier for the graphic design to be transported to the fair than it was for him. And in his diary, when he's writing about the process, he's incredibly stressed. I think those of you in design school who are designers can relate to this, but basically like he gets the commission at the end of 1899 and he has like a scant few months to basically finish the diagrams. And then they take several months to get there in time for the April opening. But he says, the details of finishing these 50 or more charts in colors with accuracy was terribly difficult with little money. Limited time and not too much encouragement. I was threatened with nervous prostration before I was done and had little money left to buy passage to Paris, nor was there a cabin left for sale. But the exhibit would fail unless I was there. So at the last moment, I bought passage in the steerage and went over and installed the work. So this idea of him traveling in the hull and kind of this reverse middle passage is this really, I think, complicated and problematic image of like a public intellectual going to this like, I guess you could kind of think of this World's Fair as kind of like maybe part Davos, part Art Basel, part computer electronics show, right? It's like kind of this combination of technology and innovation. You know, there was a recently completed Eiffel Tower. We're like leaving out of this Victorian period into like the beginning of the 20th century and a notion of modernism, even though you could argue that modernism is sort of at work already. And I think part of what's interesting is also the architectural context of the fair itself. This is a souvenir of the American Pavilion, which has this very Beaux Arts architectural position. And for the first time, the American Pavilion is in close proximity to the pavilions of England and Germany and France and these other superpowers. So it's kind of like a coming out moment for the United States and like kind of asserting its like global power. That being said, the exhibit of the American Negro, as it's called, is situated inside this less than desirable position in the Palace of Social Economy. But in this tiny little corner where there's, you know, all these other kind of like trade shows, like life insurance displays, and this kind of history of sociology as kind of diorama or tabletop models. Like think of if you've ever been to a museum of natural history, kind of, you know, like the Neanderthal in the like kind of context. Instead of doing something that's representational, Du Bois and his team use information design as a rhetorical device. And if you look at the photo documentation of this installation, which is amazing, it's modular and also interactive. So you can see that there's these like haptic frames of movable standards. They're both vertically up top where you can kind of page through them. And then also on the tabletop, you can kind of lift up these diagrams. So fairgoers could flip through these large double-sided plates with the data at these different eye levels. And in addition to these charts, the exhibition had many contributions, and he collaborated on the exhibit with both Booker T. Washington, who had a very different philosophical approach to him, and a well-connected and well-known Civil War clerk, Thomas Junius Calloway, who was friends with Du Bois from Fisk. And the three of them put this powerhouse of contributions from students and faculty of the Tuskegee Institute, Howard University, Hampton Institute, and other Black colleges, industrial schools. There are photographic prints of prominent African-American leaders and politicians. There's tools, harnesses, patents, and also a bronze statue of Frederick Douglass, who's actually the first person who coins the term, the color line, but Du Bois is the one who ends up propagating it. And so in addition to this display, I'm going to just zoom in closer on two of the plates. And when I do that, I'm also going to let you listen to Du Bois talking for a couple of minutes. This is from a autobiography where he's interviewed by Moses Ashe, who's one of the foremost African-American and Afro-American folklorists. And he's reflecting on the time of being at Atlanta University.
In 1897, I went to Atlanta University and stayed there 13 years, making a systematic study of the American Negro, which wasn't well done because we didn't have money enough or personnel to carry it out. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that for the next 25 years, there wasn't a book published on the Negro problem that didn't have to depend upon what we were doing at Atlanta University. It was the first study of the sort. Ours was the first institution in the United States, white or black, that had any course on the history of the American Negro or on Negro history in general. So that it was a good beginning. But while I was there, my faith in knowledge as a solution of the Negro problem was shaken. Lynching was common. Before I went away from there was an average of one lynching every week for some years. And it was a terrible sort of thing. There was one case very near Atlanta in which I knew from my studies just what had happened. It was a case of a Negro peasant not receiving his wages at the end of the season. He got in a fight with his hirer and killed him and ran away. And then when they couldn't find him, they raised the altogether new issue that he had raped the man's wife, which was evidently just dragged in. Well, I had a letter which I hadn't delivered to Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus tales. He was then on the Atlanta Constitution. So I took that letter and started downtown to deliver it to him and to talk to him about this situation. And on the way down, I found that this Negro, Sam Hose, had been caught and lynched, and that in the meat market, which was on the way I had to pass, his fingers and toes were being exhibited. Well, I didn't deliver the letter. I went back to Atlanta University. And then I made up my mind that knowledge wasn't enough. That even if people were ignorant of essential matters which they had to know, they wouldn't correct their actions without more realization of just what the difficulties were. They had not only to know, but they had to act.
And so this idea, Du Bois is making up his mind. And you can see the evidence of this rhetoric position where he is advocating for the equality of Black Americans through what I would argue is a very cool, in the sense of both intellectual, visual, and calculated presentation that involves design in a very skilled way for someone who's not trained in this discipline. And I think his knowledge as a sociologist and doing field research, he's able to translate that into cartographic representations where he's showing that this is systematic, right? The system of transatlantic slave trade using color, vectors, lines, and then, this statement about the color line. And this idea of design as a kind of evidence, right? charts, maps, and other devices, which I think is really interesting, where he's speculating about a possible future based on present statistics that he's gathered with his students, both through local data in Georgia, but also national data that comes from censuses, him looking at archives, but also a lot of field work to him and his students. And there is a grad student, William Andrew Rogers, who is basically the point person who's coordinating all these different teams. And you can see that they're using not a sans serif, but a typographic language that comes from engineering or architectural lettering templates, and so has no curves. But you can see that the way they're modifying the type because of these like diacritic marks in French. And I'm going to show a series of these charts quite quickly because of time, but I just want to show you a bit of the diversity of this kind of formal language that is happening a decade before the rise of dominant European avant-garde movements. And they predate modular design elements, often considered to have their origins in Russian constructivism, de style, and Italian futurism. This is 19 years before the founding of the Bauhaus. And I think offers a potential alternate sort of history of abstraction and modernism that is not necessarily coming from like this sort of spiritual interior that like Kandinsky argues, but is actually coming from a sort of rational history of sociology and data visualization that comes from statistics. And so you can see these kind of abstractions and sort of primary shapes that like connect you to the Bauhaus. Like you think of Herbert Bayer in his universal type that happens later. You know, I mentioned Kandinsky and these color tests that he would give his students. But also he was influenced and inspired by people like William Playfair, who's the Scottish statistician who created the pie chart. And of course, also Florence Nightingale, who was a nurse in the Crimean War in England and also used data visualization to create more funding for a health crisis that was coming out of the Crimean War. You know, there's these symbolic representations. Here you have bags of money standing in for actual dollar amounts that predate Otto Neurath and Marie Neurath and Gerhard Herrn's isotype. And then also the content of what they're dealing with is complex, not just sort of quantitative things, but also these qualitative things. So this is a diagram that's looking at colorism and looking at the race breakdown of Georgia people of color and using, you know, quite controversial terms for race and associating them to skin tone and color. And those kind of complex things were also being looked at in a national state. And so you can see that they are iterating and like trying different approaches. And you can see this kind of eclectic typographic language as they like run out of time and run out of money. So I'm just gonna kind of show these because I want to get to like my last argument about this idea of kind of like these lineages of history, but you can kind of think of other sort of iconic things that we see in graphic design history that Du Bois is way ahead of, and even this idea of like interaction design. And so for me, the last thing I kind of last thread I want to go through is this idea of like, what does this mean for how we teach history, and rethinking this notion of the color line, which in design history, that usually means like white, modernist, male, cis, European, right? And so how could there be other constructions or models for design history? Like, what about this idea of like chosen family or like nodal connections, where of course we're influenced by teachers like Gropius and Bayer, or like contemporaries that we have in the field, but like I can choose Elaine Leroy Locke, or I can choose Du Bois, or I can choose kind of contemporary folks or historical folks to kind of create my own lineage of design history. And that then means when you reframe these kind of like major discourses with these kind of more minor, historically marginalized voices, you can kind of create a different landscape of what design history could be. And that could become a whole course where you're like reframing, reconsidering say, streamlining with the Victor Hugo Green motorist book, or you reframe the Eames and mid-century modernism through social justice and civil rights, which are normally kind of like treated as separate histories. And that's something that I'm really interested in, like critiquing these ideas of like lineages that we get from someone like Alfred Barr, and what is a queer version of that history, for example, and what does it look like to like map the Harlem Renaissance through Blackness, but also queer publications, which is something that I'm interested in. And just the last thing that I want to show is that just a webpage for that short course that I've been talking about, that Rebecca has been talking about, where here we have this dialogue, and I think this is what Du Bois's legacy is for history and design going forward, is like, what does it mean to create design history by us, for us, you know, like the FUBU idea of design history, which for us is not just reframing the content, but how the economy works. So sliding scale for BIPOC folks, a range of voices, mainly people of color who have been doing this research, but also allyship, having a classroom that is a flattened hierarchy, and then also anti-capitalist practices of donating the proceeds and also sharing the profits with the authors, which is something that's not commonly done. And so that leaves you with this quote where I'm thinking about like how to bring this back to the present. And I feel like James Baldwin has this amazing notion that says, on the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And history is literally present in all that we do. And I think we can take Du Bois and what he's done to sort of get us to this place of like, we can redefine history through our collective dialogue together. Thanks for letting me take a little bit more time there.
Thank you, Silas. That was you moved quite incredibly from the specific to the general there. That was really interesting. So I'd like to remind everyone who's watching to please log in and put any questions or points that you want to make on YouTube, and we'll pick those up as we get into the discussion. Right now, I'd like to introduce Patricio Davila, who is, as I said, associate professor in the Department of Cinema and Media Arts in the School of Visual Arts, Media, Performance, and Design at York University, and co-director of the Public Visualization Lab. He's also a member of the Public Visualization Studio, which is connected to the lab. The lab is a kind of networked research unit between York University, OCAD University, Ryerson University, and focuses on how visualization can operate as a critical design and media practice. So in 2019, Patricio curated an exhibition in the Netherlands and Toronto called Diagrams of Power, Visualizing, Mapping, and Performing Resistance, which included information graphics from the Du Bois collection, putting them into dialogue with a range of other projects, which use data to challenge dominant narratives and support the resilience of marginalized communities. So this exhibition was also the basis for a book by the same title, Diagrams of Power, which is published by Onomatopoeia in 2019. Patricio is holding it up. So Patricio is joining us from Toronto, where it is currently lunchtime. So I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I'm really pleased to be invited to do this. It's really important to talk about these different issues. And before I do that, I wanted to also acknowledge the land that I'm speaking from. I'm speaking from Toronto, known as Tikaranto, and it has a long history of being a place where Indigenous folks have lived here, have made use of the land, have been part of the land. And I feel it's important to also, when acknowledging the territory that I'm in right now, is to also contextualize it with what I'm bringing to it. I'm a refugee from Chile from the 1970s, where there was a US backed dictatorship, a coup that displaced a a socialist, democratically elected president, and my family flew from Chile, escaping death squads. My wife also did. And the territory that received us is this territory, Turtle Island, also known as Canada. And we see ourselves now in Tikaranto. And I think it's important to kind of create this connection of what it means to acknowledge the land and to situate who I am in relationship to the territory I'm in. I'm extremely grateful for being afforded the chance to survive this family history and to make this place my home for myself, my wife, and my daughter. I'm showing you a map designed by Margaret Pierce, a Potawatomi citizen graphic designer and cartographer who's based in Maine. She was commissioned to do this map of Turtle Island called Coming Home. And it is a map that we exhibited in the Diagrams of Power exhibition. And it's a map that you don't have the English names really on the map. You have all the traditional names. These are the names, the place names that are meaningful to the First Nations, to the indigenous communities, to all the people that predate the arrival of Europeans and other settlers and immigrants. The reason I'm showing this is because it represents a very particular way of thinking about data and how it's linked to identity. These are data points on a 2D surface, on a map. And you don't see a graticule. A graticule is the grid on a map. You do have geographic points that you can locate them through land features, water features, different types of terrain. And there's maybe a highway here or there, but that's about it. There's no political borders, just landmass. And the names on it, I'm not going to zoom in actually to show you these names because they require specific permission to show you these names. What you see around the map at the top left, at the top right, at the bottom left, are the acknowledgements and the permissions given to Margaret to reproduce this knowledge, these traditional place names on the actual map. And every time that this map is reproduced in detail, where you see the names, you need to notify and renegotiate how that name is going to be presented with the traditional knowledge keepers. And this is a task that Margaret has taken on. It's not a fast process. It's a slow process, but it's a process that speaks to accountability and responsibility to the data. And not just the data, but to the people from which the data comes from. Right? And it's slow. We reproduced it in our book, and we had to go through much more work to make sure that there was buy-in from different people who are represented in the map to be reproduced in this publication. Just gonna reduce this. Sorry, 1 second. There. If you look, you can see that in here we have in the exhibition that Rebecca was mentioning, and we showed this map within a context. Next to it, on the other side, is Du Bois's charts On the left, there is this mapping project in San Francisco called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. They're putting conversation with each other because of the maxim of nothing about us without us. And I think Silas mentioned a little bit. He used a paraphrase of that, which is, how do you represent something, but you're also part of it? In order to ensure that there's some accountability, that you have stakes in how something is represented, and to go beyond the logics of extraction, so that you don't just take data from unsuspecting participants or residents or citizens and then just recontextualize it to do whatever analysis, whatever thing you want to do. I think Du Bois did that. I think Margaret Pierce has done that. I think Anti-Eviction Mapping Project has done that. They have a project where they speak to residents in San Francisco. They find out who is at the risk of being evicted. They create maps, they create documentaries, they create oral history maps. They also create events, and they also form a mutual aid network where people show up when residents are threatened with eviction. In anti-eviction work, it's no coincidence that the people who are most vulnerable to eviction and to gentrification are new immigrants, are lower income people, and or racialized people. And so there is an added importance for there to be this accountability and this reciprocity and this respect for the lived experience and who is getting represented. In the exhibition, we have a lot of different work. Here you see a little bit on the left, the different charts. These are almost life-size from Du Bois's work. We also had a lot of different speaking engagements. And here's the actual book itself. I'll play it so you don't have to buy it. You won't be able to see it. But in it, we really put into conversation not just one or two or three pieces, but 20 or 30 different projects to show the different dimensions and different ways that people can be allies and can solidarize and can work with, not just on social justice issues. An image that I want to bring up is the work of iconoclasistas. Iconoclasistas is a collective in Buenos Aires that does a lot of mapping. They do collective mapping with groups in Buenos Aires. They do participatory mapping. So they work with people to help communities and neighborhoods represent their own lived reality and the issues that are affecting their living conditions, right? The reason I bring it up is because they do a particular thing with graphics. First of all, they produce icons for working with data, with community. And these are clip art, basically. And clip art has been like the bane of graphic design. Like, I never use clip art. That's the thing. Like, I'm a real designer, I don't use clip art. In this case, they create clip art in order to facilitate ways of talking about issues and sharing data. And here I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see what kind of work they do. And I'm putting this in contrast to some work I think that Silas just showed as well, which is the work of Otto Neurath, Gerd Arts, and Marie Neurath. Here, there's for me, is a kind of famous set of images from the Isotype graphic library, which is Science for the 5 Groups of Men, which has an eerie sort of parallel to the 5 Races of Man, which is based on pseudo-racial science from the 1800s onwards. And this is not to slam Neurath, but to kind of like think about how visualization and data can, in the hands of, let's say, Neurath, be used to simplify, to condense, to reduce complexity, but also to the point of stereotype or icons that kind of represent huge swaths of people, right? And what the dangers are in doing that kind of work. And on the other side, you have iconoclastistas who are indebted to Neurath and admire Neurath. But what they do is they create a hybridity. They create a lot of different symbols and very critical symbols, as you can kind of see, which basically create more hybrid senses of what an identity is. They use these icons to represent queer activists, immigration activists, homelessness activists, for multiple forms of families, right? Not just the nuclear cis heterosexual couple, right? And so through their work, they borrow some of the visual language, but then they create more and they create complexity. One of the ways that I think about identity is also through the work that tries to reveal what happens when, especially right now, when people get sort of identified and then hate is being sort of thrust upon them. One of the projects that we recently did at the Public Visualization Lab is a work called Receipts. I'll play a little bit of it here.
Walking with my child on Dufferin Street near Dufferin Grove Park in February. We saw a masked East Asian man get heckled by a passing car. They called him Chink Flu.
I was stunned silent. My smile left my face, and not knowing what to say. I hurried along, a grown adult, feeling helpless and humiliated by kids. Creative, intelligent, funny, racist kids. And that was when he was coming to walk closer to me. I could hear it, and when I ignored him and we walked directly past each other, that was when he turned and he spat in my face, and that was a real shocking moment, as you can imagine.
Most comments were about what Chinese people ate and called us dog eaters or bad eaters. Others were about how dirty most of mainland China was, and how they weren't surprised that the virus came from there.
No words, just viciousness. There was a person walking towards us who saw it. No comments or even a moment to acknowledge what just happened. Just quick curt steps away. The spit didn't even hit us. It was just the gesture. I stared at the aggressor and held eye contact with him as we walked away. For a good 30 seconds.
The next day, I decided to post the video on my social media channels and speak up about my experience. It has become a sad but necessary reflex to record your own trauma and share it widely to hold racism to account these days. And even then, justice is never guaranteed.
That was when he was coming to walk.
So this project is quite sort of powerful, I feel, for us in our collective. One of our members, Imani Men, is Cambodian, and he's been particularly thinking about the effect of COVID on Asian folks who suffer this kind of racism, this kind of behavior all the time, and especially during a pandemic, which Trump, amongst others, has been sort of promoting as this sort of racialized pandemic. We thought it was very important to give voice to the issue. One of the ways that we did it was to create this installation. We also created a website where we collect this kind of information. And so here we collect the actual incidents. These incidents that we played through here and animated through motion capture and other 3D means, we created through data that was actually sent to us. We solicited data from people, and people are free to use a form to submit more data if they feel like they should. And in terms of identity here, we thought it was really important to bring together the shared experience of different people who are targeted for presenting as Asian. And what we also did was we anonymized. So we kind of removed the identifying aspects of the accounts in order to protect the people who are offering these testimonies. And in so doing, we created this installation. One last aspect I wanted to mention is the idea of where you're from, where you're coming from, and how you see the context of where you are. An image that has always resonated with me has been this image. This is America Invertida by Joaquin Torres Garcia. And this is a map that was done in the 1940s in order to really understand the center periphery dynamic between Europe and the rest of the world. Torres Garcia, born in Uruguay, went to Europe, went to Spain to get educated within fine art, and then went back to Uruguay. This same map has been sort of refashioned many times, and Iconoclasistas riffs on this inversion, right? So when we look at representations of data, representations of territory, we're kind of used to these conventionalized ways of seeing our context. And this, for me, is a really good illustration of how we can turn things around. We can literally turn them upside down in order to reorient ourselves to what is received knowledge, what is sort of dominant knowledge and dominant ways of looking at the world. So as you can see in Iconoclastista's map, and this is called the Mapmundi, they've inverted the map of the world, and in it they have reinscribed the invisibilized work of indigenous folks, women, and peasants within agricultural areas, and how that is actually who sustains the world. And here, a quien pertenece la tierra means who actually, or who owns the land. So it tries to really unmoor us from this conventionalized view of ownership, but also of how we imagine the world. And I just want to show one last image here. This is based also, this elongated version of I don't know if you found these forms kind of stretched and odd. They're actually part of this kind of projection called the Gauss-Peter projection, which looks stretched when we look at other ways of representing land masses on Earth. But this has the added effect of being more accurate to the actual landmass and the relationship of land masses. And here you'll see that places like the continent of Africa, the continent of South America, Asia, are much larger than they are in conventional maps, which are typically based on the Mercator sort of map. So once again, Iconoclastistas takes this sort of this counter move towards how we see the world and the relationships between first world and third world, and uses it as part of their visual language to kind of like refresh our eyes to what we see. I'm going to stop it there so that we can actually have more of a conversation, because I have a lot of things that we can, I think, talk with Silas.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patricio. I think there is a lot of stuff to talk about. There are a few really interesting questions that have come in from YouTube that I maybe want to start with, if that's okay. Jasmine Morris, one of our lecturers, has said she loves the respect that has been put on data and knowledge in the Pierce Map project, and is asking, in such a data-driven society, how can we replicate systems of respect like this? We're at the point where data can't really be traced back to an individual, because data is so much currency these days. And it relates to a question that one of our students, Libby Higgins, asks. Do we think that as information graphics becomes more and more kind of visible on social media, the success of data visualization, creating conversation and social change decreases? Is there kind of too much data that stops the data from being meaningful or being translated at all? And I think that question's, I think, addressed to Patricio, but I think it relates. Let's start with Patricio on that and then see where things go, actually, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I don't know if maybe this is too much of a cliche, but it's data is the new oil, right? That's been the thing. There's like so much of it, and so trying to treat it as a resource that you can extract and commodify. That's been kind of like the overall sort of overriding the governing sort of metaphor for data. What we see in some of these projects is that local data or slow data is actually really meaningful data. And when you think about this data that circulates very easily or that amasses a huge amount, you really have to think about what kind of insight are you actually getting from that. Sometimes you will be getting like pretty interesting insights, but at the same time, how can we ensure local meaning? Right. And so within these neighborhoods that are being organized around particular issues, either in San Francisco and Buenos Aires, for instance, it's really information that is immediately relevant to the people there. And the people produce the information, and then they act on that information. In aggregate form, then it can be these other things that they can circulate through news media. But I think the first concern is like when you're building data, it's like, who is it for? Who does it come from? And how does it come back to benefit them? And the idea of anonymizing, as you saw in the receipts project that I showed, is sometimes very needed. But when you can identify and you have local stakeholders, I think that's when it's so something that we should kind of like return to.
Okay, so that's really interesting. And actually, it sort of ties up with a question that I think, so Peter Hall has a question that I think he wrote kind of directed at Patricio, but I actually think it relates to the way that Silas ended their presentation as well. So I want to see if we can take this one to Silas first, if that's okay. So Peter says the idea of the situated history that is nodally connected is really nicely linked to the idea of the situated map maker. The idea of carefully negotiating permissions in order to represent people and their knowledge is really different from the current ways in which we represent people and their interests in business, history writing, and curriculum writing. do we need to slow down our processes of data gathering, history writing, and design dissemination? And I think that relates quite a bit to sort of where Silas ended in their presentation. Do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, hey Peter, that's an amazing question. It's very layered, and I was writing down some things when Patricio was talking. Also, Patricio, amazing presentation. That was really thoughtful and really considered. But there's this term artisanal data sets that some folks are using now, and that made me think of both this idea of like small data and slow data, it's sort of like a metaphor for like foodie culture, or kind of reconnecting to a set of maybe more human time rather than one of like industrial or digital time, which we find ourselves swept up in. I feel like there's also a couple of other practitioners, contemporary practitioners, who are dealing with like this term that Giorgia Lupi talks about, which is this idea of data humanism. And then I think Mona Chalabi, the journalist and data visualization artist, both in terms of the kinds of data sets they're talking about or discussing, but also the visual languages that they're using are connected to that. And this idea, I think, of nodality and connection is important, and like to build in systems of respect. I guess I'm not sure about the speed though, because I feel like it's sometimes, yes, we do need to slow down and consider. I think though, for particularly marginalized people, particularly Black people, at least in my experience and like what I've seen in history, and Lauren William talks about this idea of like Black past and futurity, of where people of color are always sort of seen behind the times and ahead of the times. And when it comes to like creating social justice or creating equity, I feel like people who are kind of pushing for that are often told it's going to take time. we have to wait. We need to work it out. We need to like, and I think some of that is bullshit and a bit of an excuse of like pushing back, like we don't have the money, or we're dealing with COVID-19, or there's always kind of these excuses or roadblocks or barriers. And so I think that's why for this history course that we put together, it was a sprint. And it's not that we haven't been working on this for a while, but I think there are some times where there is an urgency with some of these conversations. I think we need to respect that.
Okay, I'm going to, if it's okay, I'm going to go to another question that sort of maybe allows us to build on that back to Silas. And then I have one that I want to go back to Patricio with. So the question's from Rathna Ramanathan, who asks, how do we create a space for people who are often marginalized to feel like they can contribute to the writing stroke making of graphic design histories? Can the points you're bringing up provide a framework for this, particularly in the Global South? And actually, I think I just want to acknowledge that I think we're talking about history as data in a kind of interesting way here, almost implicitly.
Yeah,
and
totally.
I don't think that's a problem,
Totally.
but I just want to say that. So please go ahead.
Oh, so me, I'm
Silas,
responding to
that okay?
Well, that's good. I mean, I feel like, there's so much there. I feel like there's a whole like salon about that. 2 weeks ago, Dory Tunstall gave a talk at the Cooper Hewitt at the Smithsonian that I think is a really great response to this, where they asked her to analyze the collection and to speak to, and I know she was a recent colleague of yours, Patricio, at OCAD, to speak to a kind of Black experience of Black history as like one framework for looking at marginalized voices. And it was really amazing. And one of her suggestions to the institution was to also like hire a cluster of curators, like 3 curators, which is similar to what she's been doing at the institution, where she hired this cluster of Black faculty. I think what those 2 decisions or those experiments are doing is like to try to create this space of critical mass. And I think a space of nurturing. I think that's what we've attempted to do with this BIPOC history course. And then I think also like thinking about access, like access to history and also being seen in history. And so if you combine those things also with design education and like where design education is available. In the US, we have this like network of community colleges. And I think there's some pretty interesting innovations that are happening with like corporate partnerships, particularly in LA. There's this collaboration between Snapchat and latech.org, which is working with community college students to give them design training. And that like also includes like access to design history and technical training. And it's supported. So I think there actually is a big fiscal monetary issue around this. And so like, how do you bring funding for expertise or learning in a number of different contexts from like K through 12, to higher education?
Okay, thanks, Silas. Patricio, you can respond. So obviously, I'm sure you have thoughts on things that have been said more generally. I'm going to also give you a specific question because the questions that are coming through are great. This is from one of our staff members, Anushka Kenwala, and Anushka is asking, as communication designers, how can we aid complexity rather than espousing simplicity under the guise of accessibility, which is a question that is close to my heart as well. So do you want to take on sort of anything that's been said and or that question from Anushka? Thank you. Small brief.
I'll try to be as synthetic as possible. Please help me out if
I know you can do it. That's why.
Totally. Well, because I realized I missed the whole bar about the global South, and like Escobar and like all these other thoughts so I don't know if you wanted to speak to that, because that was part of the previous question.
Yeah. So this idea of complexity versus simplicity is something that I'm trying to think through. And one person who I'm reading more recently is Edouard Glissant, Martinician poet, thinker, and part of this amazing philosophic tradition within Martinique. Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire, all from Martinique. And he is a very diasporic thinker, right? And thinking about the Black experience within the Caribbean, but also what identity means. And one of the things he talks about is this idea of complexity as being more poetic, as being more true to the form of hybridity. And that there's this Western notion of simplicity, logic, transparency as being these like unexamined virtues, right? And when we look at complexity, it's seen as something like it's complicated, not complex, but complicated. It's like, let's reduce complication, right? But what in fact is like histories, especially diasporic histories, are complex and complicated and problematic and all these things, right? And so to erase to the 5 races of man, as I showed, right? It has its own form of visual violence, ideological, linguistic violence, right? And so the issue of accessibility, I think, is really interesting and is really difficult too, because there is a certain cognitive load. There is a certain level of knowing some of the nuance. One of my favorite authors is Gloria Anzaldúa, and she speaks and writes, she wrote and spoke within English and Spanish. And when I read her work, it was a laser to the back of my brain. It was like, oh my God, I understand what's going on, but it's not accessible to everybody. So in terms of access, we have to think about what access means and who is getting that access and be more specific. And to, like, I don't want to go on too long, but one thing I wanted to add to what Silas was talking about, the importance of moving on something and not being given the age-old sort of excuses for continuing oppression, right? And continuing white supremacy, saying, well, you know what, it's not ready yet. Let's wait till we get all our ducks in a row. The other aspect is also trust. So it's like, how do you build trust? And that can be a lifelong thing. This could be a community-based sort of like, how are you part of that community? And I think that may not need to be slow, but it has to be well anchored in order for that access to flourish, for who has access. And that and through this side way, I'm trying to unite this idea of accessibility with trust, and not just this rote universal design form of accessibility. So
that's really interesting, because I think trust happens at different speeds.
Yeah,
totally. And I think when you have centuries of distrust and violence and brutality that are connected to ideas of design thinking, simplicity. I mean, I think what you were pointing with Neurath is like also the reductive visual language, and reductive language is tied to an oppressive regime or history of oppression. And so like, I love this idea of complexity, or like you were alluding to, like La Frontera, and like this idea of like edges or borders and breaking those down. And like how, I think even this conversation and what we presented is like, where's the space between the intellectualism of it and the humanity of it? And I think that's so insightful, Patricio, to you to talk about where like some of these theories or these things that are liberatory are also hard to understand and digest. And so like doing that work, but also how do you deal with the context of like 30 seconds of attention, right? Or like there was that allusion to like the social feed of data, and it's like devaluing. And I'm just really, I think you're right about the poetic. Like how do you bring poetry in this like grind of capitalism?
Yeah.
So is it okay if we take a few more minutes? We're slightly over the, just like maybe, I was thinking what would be really good, because I think there was just so much in both of your presentations. I wanted to give you to end maybe by just giving you each a chance to ask the other a question. Is that okay? Would that be, I think that might be a good place to, okay, so who wants to go first?
Oh man, okay.
I don't know, I have like so many questions. Do you have one form, Patricio, that could give me time to, yeah. Go ahead.
Let me see. I have thoughts, but nothing with a question mark at the end. I have thoughts to kind of like keep the conversation going.
I'd love that.
So one thing I'm always struck, and is the legacy of modernism, and how I'm assuming your education, my education through graphic design has used modernism as this way of like, it's like the apex. It's like we're here by design, basically. It's a purification of form. It's a purification of purpose. And there's this paradigm of communication that's been drilled into my brain as an early designer. It's like, to communicate is the main purpose of being a graphic designer. And after a while, I started really pushing against that and saying, okay, so what about expression? What about representation? Because for me, once I started thinking about communication theory, right, like sender receiver, it was so linear. It was so reduced. It was so decontextualized, right? And to constantly go back to that paradigm of sender receiver kind of misses the multiplicity, the expressive potential, and the nonlinear effects of communication, right? And so I'm wondering if you've seen a bit of that with either Du Bois's work, with your own work, and how, I'm hoping that there's a complication, right, of communication that you sort of are working on or have experienced or are thinking of.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I think the thing that I think could be the most productive around that is like designing spaces for conversation, designing spaces for dialogue. And I think in my history course, because that's just the recent thing, and because of this unique moment of the pandemic and like the makeup of the students, you had, you know, like a Black design student, you know, having a conversation with, you know, white academic who's been teaching design history for many years at an established institution, and you have professional designers. And I think this like multivalent space where people can come with their different perspectives and like have conversations, and that are sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes painful. I feel like that is like a way to maybe take apart or redefine these design histories we have, or this like specter of modernism. And I feel like that is like actually a different skill set than like making a diagram or making a form. But I was able to use some of those things to like make an interesting website, make like things make sense, like make presentations that people could digest complicated ideas. And so I think that that's maybe my answer to your question. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and that I was thinking a lot, but as like your personal experiences of, you know, being a refugee and like this idea of migration and movement. And I just felt like there was a lot in your presentation. And I guess I wonder, like, how do you manage that? Because it feels like your practice is very much in many places and from many points of view. And I don't know if you have advice, you know, for students or practitioners, like how do you hold it together, I guess, with all the different things that you're doing and considering?
There's two parts to it. One is finding your people, right? Finding people who may have had a similar experience to you. And in some points of my life, that's been other Chileans, other Latin Americans who have gone through similar experiences, so that you don't have to translate things. You don't have to do the code switching. And so that you kind of like, you feel like there's a certain, a more authentic part of yourself in conversation, which is kind of intoxicating sometimes, just being a little bit more natural. Sometimes you don't have those opportunities, and so you have to find other dimensions where you're in that mode with other people. The thing that for me has been really instructive is using my own experience not as an equivalence to other people's experiences, but as a way of decentering myself and sort of making valid, for me, other people's experiences. So that for me kind of like helps me understand relationships, basically how someone might relate to a particular history, a particular topic, a particular form of working. And so those have been kind of like the coping mechanisms of a displaced person, right? And I've been displaced in Canada for a long time, so I've had a good run at it. But if you're forcing me to think about what are the particular tactics or strategies I've been kind of like going back to, and those have been particular points within my experience. But thanks for that question. I'm gonna think about it a bit more.
That's an amazing answer. That was really inspiring. Let's have like a Zoom coffee or drinks, you know, after this.
I feel like this discussion could go on and on and on and on. It's been really interesting. So I'm gonna draw it to a close. I guess one thing that I want to draw out, sort of, I guess on behalf of the CSM graphic communication design community is really kind of pulling out some thinking about how do we make information graphics and data visualization. Those practices come with a lot to consider and a lot of responsibility, and we want to approach them with nuance, with care, and space for multiplicity. And I think what's just been said is also sort of drawing on self-awareness as well as connectedness to communities. So I think that is something that I hope that everyone will be thinking about as we discuss kind of this conversation in the coming days. So the next and final event in our series is tentatively scheduled for April 20th at 5:30 p.m., but we're still kind of making arrangements for this one. So please keep an eye on the newsletter and the webpage for updates. There will also be updates on our social media at CSM Graphics on Twitter and Instagram. And I'd like to say thank you so much to Silas and Patricio for joining us and for basically joining our community this evening. I'd also like to thank Jacob Watmore and David Frame for their work on the series behind the scenes, and also Anushka Kanwala and Peter Hall for their support kind of conceiving of this particular event this evening. And that's it for now. Goodbye, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you,
Bye.
Silas.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks, Patricio. That was amazing.